August 1944. The world had been reduced to a sliver of scorched earth and a sky the color of old bruises. For Sergeant Kenji Tanaka of the Imperial Japanese Army, this island in the Pacific was not a place but a state of being, a final screaming nerve of the Empire's vast body. The air was a thick cocktail of cordite, rotting vegetation, and the metallic tang of blood, so potent it felt as if they were breathing in the very essence of death. Their world had shrunk to the length of a bayonet, the curve of a helmet, and the gnawing emptiness in their bellies, a hunger so profound it had become a form of prayer, a constant, aching reminder of their sacred duty. They were ghosts haunting their own bodies, skeletons draped in ragged uniforms, their skin drawn tight over their bones like the parchment of ancient scrolls. The Emperor's divine light, once a blazing sun in their hearts, now felt like a distant, flickering star obscured by the smoke of American naval bombardments and the ever-present dust of their crumbling fortifications. Their enemy was a creature of myth, a monster sketched in the stark, brutal lines of propaganda. The Americans were only demons with red hair and milky skin, decadent beasts who lacked discipline, honor, and the spiritual fortitude of Yamato Damashi. They were a nation of soft-fingered merchants and spoiled farmers, a culture so glutted on material excess that its spirit had atrophied. Tanaka and his men had been taught that these creatures fought without honor, that they were clumsy and cowardly, relying on a crude avalanche of steel to compensate for their hollow souls. To be captured by such an enemy was a fate worse than 1,000 deaths, a stain of shame so deep it would tarnish their ancestors and poison their descendants. The only noble path was Gyokusai, the shattering of the jewel, a final, glorious charge into the enemy's guns, a beautiful, fleeting explosion of life that would serve the Emperor and fertilize the soil of the homeland with their righteous blood. They clung to this belief as a drowning man clings to a splinter of wood in a raging sea. It was the last solid thing in a world that had dissolved into chaos and despair. Their reality, however, had systematically dismantled these myths. The Americans were not clumsy. Their artillery was a symphony of terrifying precision. They were not cowardly. Their Marines advanced with a relentless, methodical fury that was more machine than man. And their supply lines were a miracle of logistics that defied belief. For every crate of ammunition Tanaka's men hoarded, the Americans had a mountain. For every handful of rice they rationed, the Americans had hot meals steaming in metal trays. The sheer, overwhelming weight of the enemy's material superiority was a physical pressure, crushing their morale more effectively than any bomb. The final days on the island were a blur of starvation, thirst, and the drone of B-29s that sounded like the judgment of an angry god. When the end came, it was not with a glorious charge, but with the quiet, ignominious click of an empty rifle bolt and the shadow of a giant, well-fed American soldier looming over a foxhole. Capture was not a choice, it was an inevitability, a tide that could no longer be held back. As they were herded onto the landing craft, their hands bound, their heads bowed, the deepest sensation was not fear, but a bottomless, soul-crushing shame. They had failed. They had allowed themselves to become living ghosts, dishonored spectres in the land of the living. They had become that which they despised most, a prisoner of war. And they knew, with the certainty of religious dogma, what awaited them at the hands of the decadent, barbaric demons. If you're finding this exploration of a forgotten chapter of history compelling, consider subscribing and turning on notifications. You won't want to miss what happens when ideology collides with an unimaginable reality. The journey across the Pacific was a descent into a new kind of hell, a purgatory of steel and salt water. Confined to the cavernous, humid belly of a transport ship, The world became the rhythmic groan of the vessel's hull, the ceaseless slap of waves against steel, and the smell of disinfectant failing to mask the scent of unwashed bodies and collective fear. They were no longer soldiers, they were cargo, human freight being shipped to an unknown destination for an unspeakable purpose. The guards were impassive giants who moved with a casual confidence that was more unnerving than open hostility. They distributed food, a strange, soft white bread, and a paste-like meat from a can, with an efficiency that was chilling. Tanaka and his men ate it with suspicion, each bite a potential poison, each act of sustenance a deeper submission to their captors. They watched each other, their eyes communicating the silent dread that their tongues dared not speak. The propaganda films had shown them what to expect: medical experiments, brutal interrogations, public humiliation, and finally a shallow, unmarked grave. Their first glimpse of America was a shock, a profound and destabilizing assault on their senses. As the ship slid into a harbor somewhere in California, they saw not a nation crippled by war, but a land of impossible vibrancy and scale. The sky was a brilliant cloudless blue, the hills were a sun-baked gold, and the city that sprawled before them was a testament to a power they could not comprehend. Buildings scraped the sky, bridges stitched the horizon together with cables of steel, and the sheer number of automobiles gleaming like beetles in the sun suggested a level of prosperity that was mythical. This was not the decaying, decadent society they had been promised. This was a civilization at the peak of its power, a behemoth so vast and self-assured that their war seemed like a minor annoyance to it, a fly buzzing at the flank of a giant. The shame they felt was now mingled with a new, terrifying emotion, a sense of their own cosmic insignificance. Their desperate, all-consuming struggle, the sacrifices of their comrades, the sacred mission of their empire, it all seemed to shrink under the vast, indifferent California sky. The train ride inland was a further dislocation from their reality. For days, they rattled through a landscape that was a relentless display of the enemy's strength. They passed through endless fields of crops, geometrically perfect grids of green and gold that stretched to the horizon, tended not by weary peasants, but by monstrous smoke-belching machines. They saw towns where the houses were neat and brightly painted, each with its own plot of impossibly green grass. They saw children playing, women laughing, life proceeding with a placid, unbothered normality that felt like a deliberate, calculated insult. Where were the signs of sacrifice, the rationing, the fear, the gnawing anxiety of a nation locked in a death struggle? There was nothing. It was as if the war they had been fighting, the war that had consumed their entire world, simply did not exist here. It was a distant rumor, a headline in a newspaper, while the real business of life, of planting and building and living, went on uninterrupted. The cognitive dissonance was a physical weight, a pressure behind the eyes. They were prisoners being transported through the heartland of a nation that seemed not to have even noticed it was at war. It was this serene, almost arrogant normality that was the first true act of psychological warfare, more potent than any threat or physical abuse. It suggested that their entire struggle, their sacrifice, was not just failing, but was fundamentally irrelevant. This journey into the heart of an enemy's land is just the beginning. To follow this story of profound psychological transformation, make sure you're subscribed to our channel. The most shocking discoveries are yet to come. The destination was a place that defied all their categories of thought. It was a camp, yes, but it lacked the familiar architecture of suffering. There were no mud-caked trenches, no grim, concrete blockhouses. Instead, they were unloaded before a series of long wooden barracks neatly constructed and painted a sober, functional brown. The fences were topped with barbed wire, and there were guard towers, but they seemed almost perfunctory, an afterthought. The air here, in this valley, in what they later learned was the state of Arizona, was different. It was dry and clean, scented with dust and a faint, sweet smell they couldn't identify. They were marched to a processing building, a long, methodical process of delousing, showering with hot, high-pressure water, and being issued new clothing. The clothes were not the tattered rags of a conquered foe, but simple, sturdy denim trousers and work shirts, coarse but clean. The soap was harsh, but it washed away the grime of the island and the ship, a physical cleansing that left them feeling strangely vulnerable, stripped of their identity as soldiers of the Emperor. The true disorientation began with the food. That first evening, they were led into a mess hall, a vast, noisy room filled with long wooden tables. They were served not a thin, watery gruel, but a meal of substance. There was beef stew, thick with potatoes and carrots, more of the soft white bread, and a mug of hot, bitter coffee. They ate in a stunned, suspicious silence. This had to be a trick. A last meal before the executions began, a way to fatten them up for medical experiments. Sergeant Tanaka watched his men, his eyes narrowed, searching for any sign of a trap. He ate slowly, mechanically, his mind racing through the possibilities, each more sinister than the last. He saw Corporal Mori, the pragmatist, eating with a grim focus, as if memorizing the taste. He saw young Private Saito, whose eyes were wide with a childlike wonder that Tanaka found deeply disturbing. The idea that this could be anything other than a deception was too dangerous to entertain. Kindness from an enemy was a weapon, and they were all bracing for the blow. The next morning the blow came, but it was not what they expected. A stern-faced American officer, speaking through a translator, informed them of their new reality. They were not here to be tortured. They were not here to be interrogated for military secrets they no longer possessed. They were here to work. The war, the officer explained with a dispassionate air, had created a labor shortage on the home front. Their new duty, as prisoners of war under the Geneva Convention, was to provide that labor. Specifically, they were to be sent out in trucks each morning to the surrounding farms to help with the harvest. Their task was to pick cotton and harvest citrus fruits from the vast orchards that carpeted the valley. The announcement was met with a thick, uncomprehending silence. Work. Picking fruit. It was an absurdity, a surreal twist in a nightmare that had already lost all logic. They were warriors, bred for combat and sacrifice, and they were being ordered to become farmhands. It was a humiliation of a different sort, a reduction of their martial identity to that of a common peasant. But beneath the humiliation, a seed of profound confusion was planted. Why would the enemy waste resources on this? Why feed them, clothe them, and house them, only to have them pick lemons? It made no military sense. It was either a sign of profound, decadent weakness, or it was a part of a plan so subtle and complex that they could not begin to fathom its true purpose. The line between humiliation and humanity is about to blur. If you want to witness this incredible story of minds being unmade and remade, hit that like button and subscribe for more deep dives into history's hidden corners. The first day in the orchards was a fever dream. They were driven out of the camp at dawn, the trucks rumbling through a landscape bathed in the soft, golden light of the Arizona morning. The air grew sweeter as they approached the farm, a vast, sprawling enterprise owned by a weathered, stoic man named Henderson. The scent they had noticed before was now overpowering, the smell of ripe oranges, a fragrance so rich and sweet it was almost intoxicating. The trees were laid out in perfect endless rows, each one laden with fruit that glowed like miniature suns in the morning light. The sheer, breathtaking abundance of it all was the first shock. On their island, a single withered potato was a treasure to be hoarded. Here, a universe of food hung from the trees, so plentiful that much of it had already fallen to the ground to rot in the sun. It was an exhibition of waste, so profound it felt like a form of blasphemy. They were shown what to do by the farmer and a few guards, a simple process of twisting the fruit from the branch and placing it in large canvas sacks slung over their shoulders. The work was hard, repetitive, and physically demanding under the relentless sun. But it was not brutal. The guards watched them from a distance, leaning on their rifles, their expressions a mixture of boredom and indifference. They did not shout. They did not strike. They seemed more concerned with the heat than with the prisoners. At midday, a halt was called. The farmer's wife, a sturdy woman with kind eyes, drove a truck to the edge of the orchard. She brought water in large, cooled containers and sandwiches, more of the soft white bread, this time with cheese and thick slices of meat. As they ate, huddled in the shade of the orange trees, a new rule was explained to them by the translator. They were permitted to eat any of the fruit they picked. At first, no one moved. They looked at each other, then at the guards, then at the endless globes of orange fire hanging within arm's reach. It had to be a test, a trick to see who would break discipline, who would reveal their base animal instincts. It was young Private Saito who broke the spell. With a hesitant, almost fearful motion, he reached up, plucked an orange from a low-hanging branch, and began to peel it. The other prisoners watched, holding their breath, waiting for the punishment. The guards did not stir. The farmer simply nodded, as if this were the most natural thing in the world. Saito brought a slice of the fruit to his lips, his eyes closed. A shudder ran through his thin frame. For the first time in years he was tasting something other than stale rice, boiled seaweed, or the gritty reality of starvation. He was tasting the sun. He was tasting a sweetness so pure and overwhelming it felt like a memory of a life he had never lived. One by one, hesitantly at first, and then with a quiet urgency, the other men began to do the same. They ate in silence, the only sound the soft tearing of peel and the quiet, almost reverent consumption of the fruit. For Sergeant Tanaka, the experience was a form of torture more refined than any physical abuse. Each drop of sweet, sticky juice was a drop of poison, eroding the foundations of his hatred. This act of simple, casual generosity was a more powerful indictment of his worldview than any lecture or propaganda. It was an act of humanity, and it was utterly, terrifyingly disarming. He ate the orange, but in his mouth it tasted of ash and confusion. This was not weakness, this was something else, something he did not have a name for, and it frightened him more than any battlefield. This small act of kindness was a crack in the foundation of an entire ideology. What happens when that foundation begins to crumble? Click the subscribe button and join our community of history enthusiasts to find out. The days bled into weeks and the surreal became the routine. Every morning, the truck. Every day, the sun and the endless rows of trees. Every evening, the return to the camp, the hot meal, the clean bunk. The initial suspicion and fear began to slowly, imperceptibly recede, replaced by a state of chronic, low-grade bewilderment. They learned that their experience was not an anomaly. The camp held hundreds of other prisoners, Germans and Italians as well as Japanese, and they all told the same story. They worked on different farms in different fields, harvesting different crops, but the treatment was universally the same. It was a system, an organized, deliberate, and widespread policy of humane labor. This realization was in many ways more disturbing than the idea of it being an elaborate trick. A trick implies a specific, malicious intent. But a system implied a philosophy, a way of being that was fundamentally alien to them. The cognitive dissonance intensified, becoming a constant companion to their physical labor. Their minds, conditioned by years of brutal military discipline and an ideology of absolute sacrifice, struggled to process the new reality. They remembered the binter, the savage, open-handed slaps administered by their own officers for the slightest infraction, a button undone, a moment's hesitation. Here the guards were lethargic and informal, sometimes even sharing a cigarette or a piece of chewing gum. They remembered the brutal rationing at home, the desperate measures their families were taking to survive, the letters speaking of hunger and hardship. Here they saw local newspapers filled with advertisements for things they couldn't even imagine: gleaming refrigerators, miracle cleaning powders, luxurious automobiles available on easy payment plans. They were prisoners of war, living in better conditions and eating better food than their own families back home. The shame of this was a corrosive acid, eating away at their sense of self, their pride, their very identity. Sergeant Tanaka fought against it with all the spiritual strength he could muster. He tried to see this all as a sign of American weakness. Their kindness was a symptom of their softness, their abundance, a sign of their moral decay. They were trying to corrupt them, to break their spirit, not with pain, but with comfort. He would lecture his men in the barracks at night, his voice a low, urgent whisper, reminding them of their duty to the emperor, of the sacredness of their cause. He warned them not to be seduced by the enemy's material wealth. But his words began to sound hollow, even to himself. It was difficult to speak of the enemy's weakness when the evidence of their terrifying strength was all around them, hanging from every tree, gleaming in every storefront, humming in the engine of every passing truck. The Americans weren't just winning the war on the battlefield, they were winning it in the orchards, in the kitchens, in the quiet, mundane prosperity of their daily lives. The most potent weapon the Americans possessed was not their tanks or their bombers. It was the simple, undeniable fact of a glass of cold lemonade brought to them in the field on a hot afternoon by the farmer's wife, an act performed not with pity or condescension, but with a simple, unthinking decency that defied all their training and expectations. The psychological war is often more devastating than the physical one. If you're fascinated by how a simple act of decency can become a weapon, support our channel by liking this video and subscribing for more content that challenges the narratives we think we know. The true psychological erosion occurred in the small, unscripted moments of daily life. It was in the details that their entire worldview was unraveled thread by thread. Corporal Mori, the cynic, was the first to articulate the strategic implications of what they were seeing. He was a man who thought in terms of logistics and resources. One afternoon, while they were loading crates of oranges onto a truck, he watched Farmer Henderson tinkering with the engine of his tractor. The machine was a beast of green and yellow steel, powerful and complex. Henderson had a massive toolbox, and when a part was needed, he simply drove his pickup truck into town and returned with it an hour later. Mori thought of his own village, where the communal ox was the most advanced piece of agricultural machinery, and where a broken tool could mean disaster for a family. He began to see the farm not as a place of soft living, but as a factory, a component in a vast, terrifyingly efficient machine of production. Mori started to make quiet calculations in his head. A nation that could afford to pull its own young men from the fields and send them to war, replacing them with prisoners, was a nation with a surplus of manpower. A nation that could feed its prisoners 3 substantial meals a day was a nation with a surplus of food so vast it was beyond comprehension. A nation where a simple farmer possessed machinery more sophisticated than some of the equipment in their own army was a nation whose industrial base was not just superior, but from another dimension entirely. He began to understand that Japan was not fighting a nation, it was fighting a continent-sized, self-replicating industrial organism. The kindness they were shown was not weakness, it was a symptom of ultimate power. It was the casual, unthinking generosity of a giant who doesn't even notice the ant it is about to step on. The Americans could afford to be humane because the outcome of the war was, for them, a foregone conclusion. Their victory was a matter of industrial and agricultural arithmetic. For Private Saito, the transformation was more emotional, more personal. He was young, from a small fishing village, and his mind was less encrusted with the rigid doctrines of the military. He began to see the Americans not as demonic caricatures, but as people. He watched Henderson interact with his children, a boy and a girl who would sometimes come to the edge of the fields after school. He saw a gruff tenderness in the man, a way of being that was authoritative but not cruel. He watched the farmer's wife hang laundry on a line, her movements simple and rhythmic, and he was reminded of his own mother. These observations were a quiet rebellion. He was taught to see the enemy as a monolithic, hateful entity. Instead, he was seeing a family, a unit of human connection that was universally recognizable. He started to learn a few words of English from one of the guards, simple things like hello, water, and thank you. The first time he said thank you to Mrs. Henderson for a cup of water, and she smiled in return, a genuine, unforced smile. Something inside him shifted irrevocably. The enemy had a human face, and it looked disconcertingly familiar. This slow accumulation of mundane evidence was devastating. It was a war being waged not on their bodies, but on their minds. They were being conquered not by force of arms, but by the relentless, overwhelming evidence that everything they had been taught, everything they had believed, everything they had killed and died for, was a lie. A smile, a word of thanks, a functioning tractor. These were the weapons that truly broke them. To continue this exploration of the subtle ways wars are won and lost, ensure you've subscribed and hit the notification bell. Sergeant Tanaka remained the last bastion of the old world. He saw the changes in his men, and it filled him with a cold dread. He saw Mori's grim calculations, Saito's blossoming humanity, and the quiet, confused acceptance in the eyes of the others. He saw them as victims of a subtle and insidious form of spiritual poison. He retreated further into himself, into the rigid sanctuary of his beliefs. He would meditate at night, trying to reconnect with the spirit of Bushido, trying to feel the Emperor's divine presence. He would mentally recite the imperial rescript to soldiers and sailors, its familiar phrases a mantra against the encroaching chaos. Duty is heavier than a mountain, death is lighter than a feather. But the mountain of duty felt impossibly heavy in this place, and the lightness of death seemed a distant, almost childish fantasy. How could one choose a beautiful death when life was not a state of constant suffering, but one of simple, inexplicable decency? He began to compare, an involuntary and torturous exercise. He remembered his own training, these ceaseless beatings designed to forge an unbreakable will. He recalled a fellow recruit being beaten nearly to death for stealing a rice ball, his body a canvas of purple and black bruises, and he contrasted it with the image of an American guard nonchalantly tossing an apple to a German prisoner, a gesture of casual camaraderie between two men who, months earlier, had been trying to kill each other. He remembered the desperate, hoarding mentality of the island, the way men would kill for a canteen of fresh water, and he contrasted it with the sight of Farmer Henderson turning on a sprinkler system, spraying thousands of gallons of precious water onto a field of alfalfa, a crop grown not for humans but for cattle. The sheer, profligate waste of it was a testament to a level of abundance that bordered on the divine, or the demonic. The humiliation was the sharpest pang. It was the humiliation of realizing that his own nation, for all its talk of spiritual superiority, was a place of scarcity, brutality, and desperation. The decadent Americans, for all their supposed lack of discipline, had built a society of such staggering efficiency and wealth that they could afford to be kind. Their humanity was not a moral achievement, it was an industrial byproduct. It was the luxury of the overwhelmingly powerful. This thought was the most poisonous of all. It stripped the Americans of their demonic status, but also of any noble, humanistic intent. Their kindness was not a sign of a superior morality, it was a sign of a superior manufacturing base. It was the final, crushing humiliation to be the recipient of a generosity that was not even personal, a kindness that was merely the logical output of a well-run system. He was not being treated as a human being out of respect. He was being treated as a piece of machinery, a prisoner of war unit to be maintained at optimal efficiency for the purpose of agricultural labor, as per the regulations stipulated in a document signed in a distant European city. His hatred, which had been a pure, righteous fire, was now a confused, smoky mess, choking him from the inside. He was a warrior without an enemy, a zealot without a devil to fight. All that was left was the vast, indifferent blue sky, the scent of oranges, and the gnawing, unbearable truth of his own nation's insignificance. The collapse of a man's belief system is a profound and terrifying event. We are nearing the moment of ultimate realization. If you've been captivated by Sergeant Tanaka's struggle, show your support by liking the video. Your engagement helps us create more content like this. The climax of Sergeant Tanaka's internal war did not arrive with a thunderclap or a dramatic confrontation. It came on a quiet Tuesday afternoon in late October. A piece of equipment on the farm's water pump had broken. Farmer Henderson was struggling to fix it, his face streaked with grease, his knuckles raw. His son, a boy of about 16 named David, all gangly limbs and earnest concentration, was trying to help. For hours they worked in the hot sun, the prisoners continuing their own tasks nearby, occasionally glancing over at the small domestic drama. The relationship between the father and son was one of gruff, unspoken affection. Henderson would bark an order, and the boy would scramble to obey, handing him wrenches and rags. There was a tension between them, the universal friction of a son trying to prove his worth to a demanding father. Tanaka watched, and it reminded him of his own father, a stern man he had both feared and worshipped. The boy, David, was holding a heavy socket wrench while his father worked inside the pump housing. His grip slipped, and the heavy steel tool fell, striking his foot with a sickening thud. The boy cried out, hopping on one leg, his face contorting in pain. Henderson emerged, his frustration momentarily forgotten, a look of pure concern on his face. He helped his son to the ground, gently taking the boy's foot in his large, calloused hands to inspect the damage. It was not a serious injury, but the boy was clearly in pain, and more than that, humiliated by his own clumsiness. Tanaka expected an explosion of anger from the father. He expected a sharp reprimand, a lecture on carelessness, the kind of harsh lesson his own father would have delivered. In the Japanese Army, such a mistake, even an accidental one, would have been met with a swift and violent physical punishment. It was the only way to forge strength and eliminate weakness. Instead, Henderson did something that shattered Tanaka's world. He looked at his son's tear-streaked, apologetic face and he simply said, in a calm, low voice, "It's okay, son. It happens. Let's get some ice on that." He then helped his son limp back towards the farmhouse, his arm around the boy's shoulder. There was no anger, no punishment, no lecture. There was only a simple, quiet expression of compassion, acknowledgement of a mistake without condemnation, forgiveness. It was an act of grace so profound and so alien to Tanaka's entire life experience that it felt like a physical blow. He stood frozen in the middle of the orchard, a canvas sack of oranges hanging forgotten from his shoulder. The sun beat down on his head, but he felt nothing. All the pieces of his crumbling worldview, all the confusing data points of the last few months, the food, the clean clothes, the lack of beatings, the machinery, the sheer abundance, slammed into place. He finally understood. The source of America's power was not its factories or its bombs or its endless fields of grain. Those were merely symptoms of the power itself. The true fundamental strength of this nation was rooted in a culture that could afford to be kind. It was a culture that did not need to brutalize its children to make them strong, a society that did not need to terrorize its soldiers to make them obedient. Its strength came from a place of such deep-seated confidence and security that it could afford grace. It could afford to treat a clumsy son with compassion, and it could afford to treat its captured enemies with a baseline of human decency. It was the power of a people who were not afraid. And in that moment, Tanaka knew with a certainty that chilled him to the bone that a nation of fearful, brutalized men, no matter how brave or devoted, could never, ever defeat a nation of confident, compassionate ones. The war had been lost before the first shot was ever fired. It was lost in the kitchens, the workshops, and the backyards of America. This singular moment of realization changes everything. It is the core of this story. If this revelation resonated with you, please share this video with someone you think would appreciate this historical perspective, and don't forget to subscribe. The announcement of the Emperor's surrender in August of 1945 was, for the men in the Arizona camp, an anti-climax. The war had ended for them long ago, not on a battleship in Tokyo Bay, but in their own minds, in the dusty orange groves of their enemy's heartland. When the camp commander officially informed them, there was no great outcry of grief or shock. There was only a quiet, somber resignation. The news was merely a formal confirmation of a truth they had already absorbed. They had been defeated not by American bullets, but by American kindness. They had been conquered not by an invading army, but by the disorienting, world-shattering power of a different way of life. The psychological surrender had preceded the military one by many months. Sergeant Tanaka received the news with an almost serene detachment. The man who would have once chosen suicide over the shame of defeat now felt only a profound, weary emptiness. The jewel had already been shattered, not in a blaze of glory, but by the slow, inexorable pressure of a foreign reality. The process of repatriation was slow and bureaucratic. For months they remained in the camp, the routine of work and sustenance continuing even after the fighting had stopped. But something had changed in the air. The guards were more relaxed, the conversations a little easier. The vast, unbridgeable gulf between captor and captive had shrunk. They were no longer the enemy, but simply men from a defeated nation, waiting to go home. In this liminal state, the lessons of their captivity settled deep into their bones. They had arrived as soldiers, convinced of their spiritual superiority and the enemy's barbarism. They would leave as something else entirely, men whose certainties had been systematically dismantled, whose entire ideological framework had been proven to be a fragile, hollow construct. They had seen the true nature of the power they had challenged, and it was not the demonic force of their propaganda, but the mundane, overwhelming force of a prosperous, confident, and fundamentally decent society. The return to Japan was a reverse shock. They sailed back across the same ocean, but this time as free men, heading toward a home they could barely imagine. What they found was a nation in ruins, a landscape of ashes and sorrow that mirrored the devastation in their own souls. The vibrant, powerful America they had left behind was a dreamlike memory, a stark and painful contrast to the reality of their homeland. Here, there was no abundance, there was starvation. The clean, orderly world of the POW camp was replaced by the chaotic, desperate struggle for survival in a country brought to its knees. The full, bitter irony of their experience became clear. They, the prisoners, the dishonored, had lived in greater safety and comfort during the war than their own families. This knowledge was a heavy burden, a secret shame they would carry with them for the rest of their lives. It was the final, cruel twist of their defeat, to have been better cared for by their enemies than by their own leaders. Their experience in America became a private, unspoken truth, a memory too complex and contradictory to be easily shared. How could they explain it to a wife who had nearly starved, to a father who had lost his home, to a society that was trying to rebuild itself on a foundation of victimhood and sacrifice? To speak of the enemy's kindness would sound like a betrayal. To speak of their abundance would sound like a boast. And so the memory of the orange groves, of the hot meals and the clean clothes, of Farmer Henderson and his clumsy son was locked away, a secret chapter in the story of their lives. The war is over, but its lessons will echo for a lifetime. To see how this profound experience shaped the rest of their lives, subscribe and stay with us for the conclusion of this incredible story. In the decades that followed, the survivors of the Arizona camp carried the memory of their captivity like a hidden compass, a secret navigational point in the map of their post-war lives. They assimilated back into a new Japan, a nation that was being rebuilt, often with the help of the very enemy that had defeated it. The world they had fought to defend was gone, replaced by a society that was rapidly embracing the very things they had been taught to despise: materialism, individualism, democracy. For many of their generation, this was a source of confusion and resentment. But for the men who had picked fruit under the Arizona sun, it was simply the logical conclusion of a war whose outcome they had understood long before it was over. Sergeant Kenji Tanaka, the man whose spirit had been forged in the crucible of imperial ideology, did not take his own life. He did not waste away in bitterness. Instead, he became a school teacher. In a small, quiet classroom, he dedicated his life to teaching history, but he did not teach the glorious myths of the past. He taught a different kind of lesson. He taught his students about the importance of knowing your adversary, of understanding the world not as you wish it to be, but as it is. He never spoke directly of his time as a prisoner, but sometimes, when explaining the concept of industrial power or national resources, his gaze would drift to the window, and his students would see a strange, distant look in his eyes, as if he were seeing something far beyond the schoolyard, an endless row of trees laden with fruit, a testament to a power more profound than any army. He taught his students to be strong, but he redefined the meaning of strength. It was not about blind obedience or a willingness to die. It was about resilience, adaptability, and the courage to accept a difficult truth. Private Isamu Saito returned to his coastal village and became a farmer. He applied himself to the task with a quiet, fierce determination. He experimented with new techniques, with irrigation and crop rotation, trying to replicate on his small plot of land a fraction of the incredible efficiency he had witnessed in America. His neighbors thought him strange, this man who was obsessed with the details of soil composition and water management. But his farm prospered. He married, had children, and then grandchildren. And on hot summer afternoons, when he would bring his grandchildren slices of cold watermelon as they played, he would sometimes be struck by a powerful sense of déjà vu. He would remember a sturdy woman with kind eyes, a glass of lemonade, and the startling revolutionary power of a simple, unearned act of human decency. He had learned in America that abundance was not an accident. It was the result of a system, of knowledge, and of a certain kind of spirit. It was a lesson he spent the rest of his life trying to cultivate in his own soil. The legacy of their experience was not a grand public narrative, but a collection of quiet, private transformations. They were men who had been sent to fight a demonic caricature and had instead discovered a complex and powerful human reality. They had been conquered, but in their defeat they had been given a profound and enduring gift, the destruction of a lie. They had seen firsthand that a society's true strength is not measured in its capacity for cruelty and sacrifice, but in its capacity for creation, for innovation, and for grace. The memory of the kindness shown to them by their enemies was not a source of shame, but a quiet, guiding principle. It was a reminder that the world was infinitely more complex than the simple, brutal ideologies that drive men to war. And in the silent, sun-drenched fields of their memory, the orange groves of Arizona stood as a permanent, shimmering monument to the war they had lost and the humanity they had unexpectedly found.